The New Mexico sun was not a celestial body, but a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the earth until the ground cracked in protest. It was late August in the year 1878, and the territory was brittle. The wind that swept across the basin carried no moisture, only the fine, alkaline grit that settled into the creases of clothing and the lines of human faces. Eleanor Harper, known to everyone in the valley simply as Nell, stood at the windlass of the ranch well, her boots anchored in the red dust. She was 20 years old, though the sun and the wind had already begun to etch the corners of her eyes with the fine map of a hard life. She leaned her weight against the crank, feeling the resistance of the bucket deep below. The wood of the handle was polished smooth by years of use, yet it still found ways to bite into her palms. Her hands were not the soft, pale hands of the ladies in the fashion plates Aunt Lydia sometimes received from St. Louis. They were brown, strong, and calloused, with fingernails cut short and knuckles reddened by work. She hauled the bucket up, the wet rope groaning against the pulley. When it cleared the lip of the stone casing, she swung it onto the ledge. The water was muddy and low. It smelled faintly of minerals and stagnant earth. Far to the west, over the Dragoon Mountains, dark bruised clouds piled atop one another, flickering with silent lightning. It was a cruel tease. The thunder would roll down into the valley, shaking the window panes of the ranch house, but the rain would evaporate before it ever touched the thirsty soil. Nell wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of mud against her skin. She looked out over the Harper grazing land. The cattle were scattered and lethargic, ribs showing through their dusty hides like the staves of a barrel. The herd had thinned by nearly 40 head since winter, lost to sickness, theft, or simply the lack of grass. The vastness of the landscape usually gave her a sense of peace, but today it felt like a cage without bars. The horizon was so far away that it made her own life feel insignificant, her dreams of seeing something beyond this valley shrinking until they were no bigger than the pebbles at her feet. "Eleanor." The voice cracked through the dry air like a whip. Nell sighed, hoisting the water bucket. "Coming. Pa," she called back. Thomas Harper stood on the porch of the main house, a structure of rough-hewn timber and adobe that seemed to be slowly sinking back into the earth. He was a man consumed by the land he tried to tame. His face was a mask of leather and gray stubble, his eyes permanently narrowed against the glare and the worry that gnawed at his gut. He held a ledger in one hand, the pages fluttering in the hot breeze. "This account with Eldridge is past due again," Thomas said as Nell approached, dumping the water into the trough for the horses near the porch. He watched the water splash, counting every drop as if it were coin. "We are going to have to sell the roan mare. I told Luke to see to it, but the boy is nowhere to be found." "Luke is checking the south fence line," Nell said, wiping her hands on her apron. "He took the roan with him. He said the wire was cut near the arroyo." Thomas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Cut wire. Probably those savages again. Or rustlers. It makes no difference. We are bleeding to death here. Nell, bleeding dry." The screen door creaked open, and Aunt Lydia stepped out. She was a woman who wore her respectability like a suit of armor, sweating in a high-collared dress despite the heat. She fanned herself with a folded newspaper, her eyes darting between Thomas and Nell. "Mr. Eldridge asked about you again after church on Sunday." "Eleanor," Lydia said, her voice sugary but sharp underneath. "He is a good man. He owns the mercantile free and clear. A woman could do a lot worse than a man with a brick storefront and a steady trade." Nell picked up the empty bucket. "He is 40 years old, Aunt Lydia, and he has wet hands. Security does not care about wet hands," Lydia snapped. "Look around you, girl. Your father is drowning in debt. The army cannot protect us. You are 20. In this territory? That is practically a spinster." "Mr. Eldridge offers a house with glass windows and a cellar full of flour. You would be safe." Safe, Nell thought. That was the word they always used. Safety was the god they sacrificed everything to. She looked at her father, waiting for him to defend her, to say that she was needed here on the ranch, that she was more than just a mouth to feed or a bargaining chip for store credit. Thomas just stared at the ledger. "Think on it." "Nell," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "We cannot keep going like this. If the bank calls the note in October, we lose everything." Nell turned away, a lump of cold resentment forming in her throat. She walked back toward the barn, the heat shimmering off the ground. She remembered the way her mother used to look at this land, with a kind of terrified awe. Her mother had been soft, a woman of books and piano music, ill-suited for the frontier. The memory hit Nell as it often did, unbidden and sharp. She had been 8 years old. It was a raid, not by the local bands, but a splinter group moving fast toward Mexico. She remembered the sound first, not a war cry, but the thudding of hooves that vibrated through the floorboards. Then the glass breaking, the smell of smoke, acrid and choking. She had hidden in the root cellar, peering through a crack in the floorboards above. She remembered screams, confused and high-pitched. She remembered seeing a silhouette against the burning barn, a tall, powerful figure with long hair, holding a torch. For years, that silhouette had been the monster in her nightmares. The Apache. The enemy. The stories told in town reinforced it. They were savages, godless heathens who killed for sport. But as Nell grew older, the memory had shifted. She remembered now that the figure hadn't thrown the torch at the house, but at the hay wagon. She remembered her mother wasn't killed by the man with the torch, but by a stray bullet from the soldiers who arrived 10 minutes too late, firing wildly into the smoke. But that was a truth her father refused to hear. To Thomas Harper, the Apache killed his wife, and that was the stone foundation of his hate. Nell entered the barn, the shadows offering a brief respite from the sun. She began to fork hay for the milk cow, the rhythmic motion soothing her anger. Suddenly, the dogs outside began to bark, a frantic, aggressive sound that signaled strangers. Nell dropped the pitchfork and ran to the barn door. On the northern ridge, silhouetted against the blinding white sky, sat a line of riders. There were 6 of them. They sat their ponies with a stillness that made them look like statues carved from the rock itself. "Luke!" Thomas shouted from the house. Nell looked toward the south pasture. Luke was galloping back, dust kicking up behind the roan mare. He was 18, full of a restless, dangerous energy that came from trying to be a man in a world that treated him like a boy. He slid the horse to a halt near the porch and tore the Winchester rifle from its scabbard. "Don't shoot!" Nell screamed. Running across the yard, Luke had the stock against his shoulder, aiming at the ridge. Thomas was on the porch now, clutching a shotgun, his face pale. "They are just watching." "Luke," Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly, "if you fire, you will bring the whole nation down on us. They are scouting us." Luke spat, his finger tightening near the trigger. "Looking for holes in the defense. I say we drop one and teach them a lesson." "Put it down," Thomas ordered, though he didn't lower his own weapon. Nell stopped in the middle of the yard, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up at the ridge. The distance was significant, perhaps 300 yards. But the air was so clear she felt she could see the features of the lead rider. He rode a paint horse with a dark mane. He wore a simple calico shirt, dusty and faded, and a strip of red cloth tied around his forehead. He was not looking at the cattle. He was not looking at the guns in Luke and Thomas's hands. He was looking at her. It was a gaze that felt physical, traversing the dry air between them. Nell felt a strange sensation, a mix of the terror she had been taught to feel and a sudden, electric curiosity she could not explain. He did not look like a monster. He looked tired. He looked like a man who carried a weight even heavier than the sun. For 10 seconds, the world held its breath. The dogs ceased their barking, sensing the tension. Then, the rider on the paint horse raised one hand, palm out. It was not a greeting, but an acknowledgement. He turned his horse with a subtle shift of his weight, and the group vanished behind the ridge as if they had melted into the heat haze. Luke lowered the rifle, his face flushed with adrenaline and rage. "We have to go after them," he said. "They are on our land." "Let them go," Thomas said, leaning heavily against the porch rail. "We don't have the ammunition for a war. Luke, not today. That night, the tension followed them into town. The Harper Ranch lay 5 miles from the settlement of Senado Creek, a collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to the edge of the military road. Nell worked 3 nights a week at the saloon and dining hall, serving stew and whiskey to supplement the ranch's failing income. It was work Aunt Lydia despised, calling it common. But the $3 a week bought flour and coffee. The saloon was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Men crowded the tables, ranch hands, drifters, and a group of soldiers from Fort Gannon nearby. Nell moved through the room with a heavy tray, dodging grasping hands and ignoring the lewd comments that followed her. She set a bowl of stew down in front of Captain Hayes, a weary-looking officer with gray at his temples and a uniform that had seen too much dust. He was arguing with Vance, a local cattleman who had lost a brother to a raid the year before. "I am telling you." "Captain," Vance said, slamming his fist on the table, "they are getting bold. They were spotted near the Harper place today. If the army won't clean them out, we will form a militia and do it ourselves." Hayes took a slow sip of his beer. He looked exhausted. "And I am telling you, Vance, that my orders are to contain, not exterminate. The warmongers in Washington want a treaty, not a massacre. Every time you hotheads go out and take a potshot at an Apache, you make my job impossible. Colonel is not a fool. If you push him, he will push back, and he knows this terrain better than you ever will. He is a savage." Vance spat. "He is a tactician," Hayes corrected. "And he is hungry. A hungry man protects his family. You would do the same." Nell froze, the coffee pot hovering over a cup. It was the first time she had heard a white man speak of them as men. Vance sneered. "You sound like an Indian lover. Hayes, maybe you should go live in a wickiup. I sound like a man who is tired of burying boys from Ohio and New York, who died because a rancher got greedy with his fences," Hayes said quietly. Nell poured the coffee, her hand trembling slightly. She felt Vance's eyes on her. "Ask the girl," Vance said. "Her mother was killed by them. What do you think, Nell? Should we make peace with the animals who burned your barn?" The room went quiet. Nell felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes. She thought of the silhouette on the ridge, the tired set of his shoulders. "I think," she said, her voice low but clear, "that there has been enough dying. On both sides." Vance laughed, a harsh, barking sound. A woman's answer, soft. "That softness will get you killed. Girl." A few days later, the softness vanished. The heat had not broken. Luke, brooding and humiliated by his father's inaction, had been spending time with Vance's eldest son, a boy named Caleb. They were young, full of whiskey and the toxic stories of the older men. It happened on a Tuesday. Nell was in the kitchen kneading dough when the sound of galloping horses thundered into the yard. She ran out to see Luke sliding from his saddle. He was pale, his shirt torn, streaks of blood on his sleeve that did not look like his own. "Get inside!" Luke screamed, his eyes wide with panic. "Get inside and load the guns!" Thomas came running from the corral. "What have you done, boy?" Luke collapsed onto the porch steps, gasping for air. "We saw a scouting party, just 3 of them. Down in the Box Canyon. Caleb said we could spook them, make them run." Thomas grabbed Luke by the collar and hauled him up. "What did you do?" "We fired." Luke sobbed. "We just wanted to scare them, but they fired back. They were waiting. They were everywhere." "Where is Caleb?" Nell asked, her hands covered in flour, dread pooling in her stomach. Luke looked at her, his eyes hollow. "He didn't make it out of the ravine. I left him. I had to leave him." The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. Luke had started a war. By the next afternoon, the repercussions arrived. Caleb's body had been recovered by the army, along with the body of a young Apache man found nearby. The town was in an uproar. The colonel at Fort Gannon declared that the truce was broken. He sent word that a full campaign would launch as soon as the weather cooled enough to move the heavy supply wagons. He blamed Colonel's band for the escalation, but Colonel did not wait for the weather to cool. 2 days after the skirmish, at dusk, the crickets suddenly stopped singing. Nell was on the porch, watching the purple shadows stretch across the yard. The air changed. It became charged, electric. Thomas came out, holding his shotgun. "Stay behind me," he whispered. They emerged from the twilight like ghosts. Not 3 riders this time, 50. They lined the ridges surrounding the ranch house, a semicircle of silent judgment. They were painted for war, strips of black and yellow across their chests, lances and carbines in hand, but they did not attack. They simply sat there, their horses stamping softly in the dust. The sheer number of them was overwhelming. If they charged, the Harper Ranch would be ash in 10 minutes. Then, the center of the line parted. The rider on the paint horse rode forward. He carried no weapon in his hands. Instead, he held a long stick with a piece of white cloth tied to the end. "It is a parley," Thomas whispered, lowering the shotgun an inch. "He wants to talk." Captain Hayes, who had been patrolling nearby and had ridden hard to the ranch when his scouts spotted the movement, stepped out from the barn shadows. He was flanked by 2 sergeants. "I will handle this." "Harper," Hayes said, "keep your weapon down." Colonet rode until he was 20 paces from the porch. Up close, he was terrifying and magnificent. His face was broad, with high, sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold the darkness of the deepest canyons. He wore a necklace of bone and silver, and his chest was bare save for a leather vest. He looked at Hayes, then at Thomas. Finally, his eyes flickered to Nell, who stood in the shadow of the doorframe. A young man riding beside him spoke in halting English. "Colonet speaks," the translator said. "He says the blood spilled was not of his choosing. The boy who died was his nephew." Captain Hayes stepped forward. "Your men killed a settler, Colonet. The army cannot ignore this. You must surrender the men responsible." The translator spoke to Colonet in the guttural, flowing Apache tongue. Colonet listened, his face impassive. He replied in a low, resonant voice that seemed to vibrate in the ground. The translator turned back to the white men. "He says the white boy fired first. It was self-defense, but Colonet wishes for no more war. The winter comes. His people need to hunt, not fight. He offers restitution. He has 30 head of cattle taken from the Mexicans in the south. He will give them to the father of the dead white boy. A life for a life. A trade." Hayes shook his head. "I cannot accept that. The colonel wants a surrender. You must go to the reservation at San Carlos. There is no other way." Colonet's eyes hardened when the translation came. He spoke sharply. "He says San Carlos is a place of death," the translator said, his voice trembling. "The water is bad. The people die of fever. He will not take his children there." "Then we fight," Hayes said heavily. "I am sorry." Colonet sat silent for a long moment. The warriors on the ridge shifted their grips on their weapons. Luke, peeking through the shuttered window, made a sound of pure fear. Colonet spoke again. This time, his voice was different, softer, yet with the weight of iron. He pointed to the ranch house, he pointed to the land, and then he pointed to Nell. Thomas stiffened. "What is he saying?" The translator looked uncomfortable. He glanced at Nell, then at the ground. "He says there is another way to make peace, a way the old ones used, a bridge between enemies. Speak plain, man," Thomas barked. "He proposes an alliance," the translator said. "A marriage. He says if he takes a daughter of the white men into his tent, and she becomes the mother of his children, then the blood is mixed. You cannot kill his people without killing your own kin. He says this will stop the war. He says he will take the woman there." The translator pointed a shaking finger at Nell. The silence that fell over the yard was absolute. The wind died. The cattle stopped lowing. Thomas Harper's face turned purple. "You tell him to go to hell. I would sooner see her dead." Hayes looked at Thomas, then at the 50 warriors on the ridge. He looked at the dry, indefensible ranch house. "He is offering a political alliance." "Harper," Hayes said quietly. "It is medieval, but it would stop the campaign. Get off my land," Thomas hissed at Hayes, "and tell him to leave before I empty this gun." Colonet did not need a translation for the tone. He looked at Thomas with cold disdain. Then he looked at Nell. She felt pinned by his gaze. It was not a look of lust. It was a look of assessment. He was measuring her strength. He was asking a question without words. He saw the poverty of the ranch, the fear in her father, the desperation in her brother. He saw the trap she was already in. Colane spoke one final sentence in English, the words heavily accented but distinct. "Think," he said. He turned his horse. At his signal, the 50 warriors turned as one. They did not gallop away. They walked their horses slowly, deliberately, fading back into the darkness from which they came, leaving the Harper family standing in the dust, the impossible offer hanging in the air like the ozone smell before a storm. Nell stood gripping the doorframe, her knuckles white. She looked at the empty ridge, her heart beating a rhythm that felt like a war drum. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the decision had already been made. The world she knew had just ended. The only question now was whether she would survive the new one. The news of Colane's offer traveled through Sonado Creek like a fever, moving from the saloon to the church pews, and finally out to the scattered homesteads where men plowed dust and prayed for rain. At first, it was treated as a grim joke. Men leaned against the bar rail, wiping beer foam from their mustaches, and laughed until they coughed. The idea that a savage, a man who painted his face and lived in the rocks like a coyote, would demand a white bride was absurd. It was an insult so profound that some argued they should ride out and hang him for the suggestion alone. But as the laughter died down, a cold silence took its place. The drought had not broken. The army supply wagons were late, and everyone knew that if the colonel launched his campaign, the Apache would not stand and fight in open battle. They would scatter. They would raid isolated cabins. They would burn the wheat fields and cut the telegraph wires. The valley would bleed, and Sonado Creek would be nothing more than another ghost town on a map of the territory. In the dim light of the Harper parlor, the laughter of the town felt very far away. Captain Hayes sat in the high-backed armchair, his hat resting on his knee. He looked older than his 40 years. The lines around his mouth were deep, etched by command and compromise. Thomas Harper poured whiskey into 2 glasses with a shaking hand. The clink of the bottle against the rim was the only sound in the room. "It is madness," Thomas said, his voice thick. "You cannot ask this of me. Captain, she is my daughter." Hayes took the glass but did not drink. "I am not asking. Thomas, I am telling you the reality of our position. The colonel wants a victory, but he does not have the men to guarantee the safety of this valley. If Colane goes to war, he will start here. Your ranch is the first line. Your cattle are the first to be slaughtered. Your son." Hayes let the sentence hang in the air. He did not need to finish it. They all knew Luke was reckless, a boy trying to fill a man's boots and likely to die in them. "We have a chance to buy a peace that the government cannot afford." Hayes continued softly. "Colane is a man of his word. If he binds himself to this family, he binds himself to the peace." Thomas stared into his whiskey. The amber liquid trembled. "Why us?" Thomas whispered. "Why Eleanor?" "Because you are here," Hayes said, his voice devoid of pity. "Because you are vulnerable, and because, quite frankly, you have the most to lose. If this war starts, the bank will not wait for the smoke to clear before they foreclose. You are a drowning man. Thomas, this is a rope." Thomas squeezed his eyes shut. He saw the ledger with its red ink. He saw the fence lines he could not afford to mend. He saw the grave of his wife on the hill, the earth dry and cracked over her bones. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in his gut. He realized with a sick jolt that he was considering it. He was weighing his daughter's life against the deed to the ranch, and the scale was tipping. In the kitchen, Nell stood by the wood stove, her hands gripping the iron edge until her palms burned. She could hear every word. The walls of the house were thin, and the men did not bother to lower their voices. She felt a sensation of drowning, the air in the room too thick to breathe. Aunt Lydia sat at the kitchen table, shelling peas into a tin bowl. The rhythm was maddening. "Plink, plink, plink. He is right, you know," Lydia said without looking up. Nell turned slowly. Her aunt's face was composed, a mask of pious resignation. How can you say that? Nell asked, her voice trembling. You heard them. They are selling me, like a broodmare. Lydia stopped shelling. She looked at Nell with eyes that were hard and bright. Do not be dramatic. Eleanor, it is unbecoming. Look at your life. Look at this house. The roof leaks. The flour is full of weevils. Your father is a broken man. Luke is wild and will likely be dead before the first snow if the fighting starts. Lydia stood up and wiped her hands on her apron. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. Mr. Eldridge was your best chance, but you turned your nose up at him. Now, what are your prospects? You are 20. You have no dowry. You have rough hands and a sharp tongue. Do you think a prince is coming to rescue you from the high desert? Nell stepped back, backing into the warmth of the stove. He is an Apache. Aunt Lydia, you told me they were devils. You told me they have no souls. Lydia's expression flickered, a momentary crack in her armor, but she smoothed it over with the practiced ease of a woman who had survived the frontier by hardening her heart. Perhaps they are, she said. Or perhaps they are just men. It does not matter. The Bible tells us that a woman's duty is to her family. Think of it as a sacrifice. Eleanor, a noble one, like Esther going to the king of Persia. You could save this ranch. You could save Luke. Is that not worth more than your pride? Nell felt the trap snap shut. It wasn't the soldiers or the Apache who had cornered her. It was her own blood. She looked at the window, where the night pressed against the glass, black and impenetrable. She felt a surge of horror so potent it made her knees weak. She imagined the smell of smoke, the rough language she did not speak, the isolation of a life among people she had been taught to fear since she was a child. But beneath the horror, there was something else. A small, treacherous voice in the back of her mind. If she stayed, she would marry a shopkeeper or a ranch hand. She would grow old in this kitchen. Listening to her father complain about the weather and the debt, she would be safe. Yes, but she would be invisible. She would be a workhorse, driven until she dropped. Her voice never heard. Her thoughts never asked for. At least the Apache had looked at her. He had looked at her and seen something worth bargaining for. I need air, Nell said, choking on the words. She pushed past her aunt and fled out the back door, the screen slamming shut behind her. The night air was sharp and cold, a stark contrast to the heat of the day. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the sky like spilled salt on black velvet. Nell walked past the barn, past the corral where the horses dozed, and out to the edge of the creek bed. The water was gone, leaving only cracked mud and white stones that glowed in the starlight. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Shivering, she wanted to scream, but the silence of the land was too vast. It would swallow her voice and give nothing back. You walk with heavy feet. The voice came from the shadows of the cottonwood trees. Nell gasped and spun around, her hand going to her throat. Colonel stood there. He had not been there a moment ago. She was sure of it. He seemed to have materialized from the darkness itself. He was not painted for war tonight. He wore a simple shirt of buckskin and trousers of rough wool. His hair hung loose around his shoulders. He stood 10 paces away, keeping a respectful distance. Nell's heart hammered against her ribs. She should run. She should scream for Luke. But her feet remained rooted to the earth. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice sounding thin and brittle. If my brother sees you, he will shoot. Colonel looked toward the ranch house, where the yellow light of the lantern spilled onto the porch. Your brother sleeps with one eye open, but he does not see what is in the dark, Colonel said. His English was slow, the words chosen with care, the consonants hard and distinct. He took a step closer, moving into the starlight. Nell saw his face clearly. The haunted look she had seen during the parley was still there. It was in the set of his jaw, the deep lines around his eyes. He did not look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had walked a very long road. Why did you ask for me? Nell demanded. The anger gave her courage. Why not cattle? Why not guns? Colonel looked at her, his dark eyes unblinking. Cattle die, he said simply. Guns break. He looked out at the dry creek bed, his profile sharp against the stars. I had a wife. he said. Her name was Esant. She was good. She laughed much. Nell waited. The breath caught in her throat. The soldiers came 3 winters ago. Colonel continued, his voice devoid of emotion, which made the words worse. We were moving to the high ground. They fired into the canyon. She was carrying our son. They are both in the ground now. Nell felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the wind. She remembered the stories she had heard, the army reports of victories against hostile bands. She had never thought about who was on the receiving end of those bullets. I am sorry, she whispered. Colonel turned back to her. He did not want her pity. I do not tell you this for sorrow. He said, I tell you because you must know. I do not want a white woman in my tent to boast. I do not want a servant. Then what do you want? Nell asked. He gestured to the land around them, the vast, empty, brutal landscape that held them both. I want the dying to stop, he said. My people are tired. We run and we run, but the fences keep coming. The soldiers keep coming. If I fight, we die. If I surrender to the agency, we die slowly. The spirit goes out of us. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the wood smoke and sage on his clothes, close enough to see the pulse beating in his throat. But if we are joined, he said, his voice dropping low, if the blood of the white man and the Apache are mixed, it is a tie they cannot cut. Your father will not let the soldiers kill his daughter's husband. My people will not kill the kin of their leader's wife. It is a wall we build together. Nell looked up at him. He was offering her a marriage of politics, cold and practical. Yet, there was a desperate honesty in his eyes. He was trusting her with the survival of his people. He was placing his life and the lives of his remaining kin in her hands. It is a hard life, Colonel said, watching her face. The mountains are cold. The food is not like your house. You will work. You will be afraid. I am already afraid, Nell said. Her voice surprised her. It was steady. I am afraid every day. I am afraid of the bank. I am afraid of the drought. I am afraid of shrinking until I am nothing but a shadow in my father's house. Colonel studied her. For the first time, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, a ghost of a smile. You have the eyes of one who sees far, he said, like a hawk. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he slowly, deliberately, touched the tips of his fingers to her shoulder. It was a test, a question. Nell did not flinch. The heat of his hand seeped through her shawl. It was a human touch. It was not the grasping hand of a drunk in the saloon, nor the dismissive pat of her father. It was an acknowledgment of her reality. I will not force you, Colonel said, pulling his hand back. If you say no, I will ride away. The war will come, but I will not take you screaming. Nell looked at the ranch house. She saw the silhouette of her father pacing past the window. She saw the smallness of it, the suffocating, dusty smallness. Then she looked at Colonel. She saw the danger, she saw the hardship, but she also saw a horizon that did not end at the fence line. Wait here, she said. She turned and walked back to the house. She did not run. She walked with a new rhythm, her boots striking the earth with purpose. When she entered the kitchen, the conversation stopped. Thomas looked up from his whiskey, his eyes red-rimmed and fearful. Aunt Lydia paused with a bowl of peas. Captain Hayes stood up. Sensing the change in the air, Nell stood in the center of the room. She felt tall. I will do it, she said. Thomas let out a breath that was half a sob. Eleanor, I will do it, Nell repeated, her voice cutting through his weakness. But not for you, Pa, and not for the ranch. She looked at Captain Hayes. I am doing it because I choose to, and you will write it down. Captain, you will write down that this war is over. You will make it a law. Because if I go out there, and you send soldiers after us, I will never forgive you. Thomas stood up, reaching for her hand. Nell, listen to me. Don't, Nell said, pulling her hand away. Do not speak to me of duty, and do not speak of me when I am gone as if I was stolen. I am walking out that door. I am not being taken. She turned and walked to her room to pack. She took very little. A heavy wool coat, her mother's Bible, a sewing kit. She left the silk ribbons Aunt Lydia had given her. She left the life that had been planned for her on the hook behind the door. The wedding took place 2 days later in the square of Sonado Creek. It was a spectacle that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. The sun beat down with a vengeance, bleaching the colors from the world. The town was packed. Settlers had ridden in from miles around, drawn by the morbid curiosity of seeing a white woman given to the tribes. Soldiers from the fort lined the street, their carbines held at port arms, their faces sweating under the brims of their kepis. Nell stood on the steps of the small wooden church. She wore her best dress, a plain blue cotton that had been patched at the hem. She refused to wear a veil. She wanted to see them. She wanted to see the faces of the people who had called her neighbors. Colonel stood beside her. He had not dressed in white man's clothes. He wore his buckskins, clean and brushed, and a single eagle feather in his hair. He stood tall, ignoring the whispers, the pointing fingers, the palpable hatred that radiated from the crowd like heat from a stove. The preacher, a young man named Reverend Sallow, was terrified. His hands shook so badly that the pages of his Bible rustled audibly. He stumbled over the words, rushing through the liturgy as if speaking the holy words too slowly would invite lightning to strike him down. Do you, Colonel, take this woman. Colonel did not look at the preacher. He looked at Nell. I take her, he said, his voice carried to the back of the crowd. And do you? Eleanor Harper, I do. Nell said, there were no rings. The Apache did not use them. Instead, Colonel reached into a pouch at his belt. He pulled out a necklace. It was simple, strands of leather braided together, strung with dark glass beads and a centerpiece of polished white bone, carved with intricate geometric lines. He stepped forward and placed it over her head. The bone settled against her collarbone, cool and heavy. It felt ancient. It felt permanent. From the crowd, a voice rang out. She's wearing dog bones now. Laughter rippled through the onlookers, nervous and cruel. Nell stiffened, her cheeks burning with a flush of shame and anger. She looked into the crowd and saw the faces of men she had served coffee to, women she had sat beside in church. They were sneering. They were spitting into the dust. To them, she was no longer Nell Harper. She was something other. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Just look at her, a woman whispered loudly. She's disgraced her mother's memory. Nell felt tears prick her eyes, hot and stinging. She wanted to shout at them. She wanted to tell them she was doing this for them, for their safety, for their ungrateful hides. Then she felt a hand on her arm. Colonel was looking at her. His expression was calm, an anchor in the storm of mockery. He did not speak, but his eyes said, "They do not matter. We are here. They are there." The ceremony ended with a muttered prayer. There was no kiss. It would have caused a riot. The Apache party was waiting at the edge of town, 20 warriors sitting on their horses in silence. Colonel led Nell toward them. She stopped at the hitching post where a sturdy Mustang mare stood saddled for her. She turned back one last time. Thomas Harper stood on the boardwalk. He looked old and broken. He could not meet her eyes. He stared at his boots, his hat crumbled in his hands. Luke stood beside him. His young face was wet with tears, his expression a mask of confusion and helpless rage. He took a half-step forward, his hand reaching out. "Nell," he croaked. "Goodbye." "Luke," Nell said softly, "don't let the fence fall." Aunt Lydia was weeping theatrically into a handkerchief, wailing about the heathen wilderness. Nell felt a sudden surge of pity for her. Lydia would die in this town, bitter and afraid, never knowing what lay beyond the ridge. Nell turned to the horse. The stirrup was high. She grabbed the pommel and pulled herself up. The saddle was rough leather, harder than she was used to. The mare shifted her weight, sensing the tension of the rider. Colonel mounted his paint horse in one fluid motion. He raised his hand, and the warriors turned their mounts. They rode out of Sonado Creek at a walk. The only sound was the clopping of hooves and the creak of leather. The townsfolk watched them go, their mockery fading into a sullen silence as the reality of the departure set in. They rode past the last building, past the graveyard, past the turnoff to the Harper Ranch. Nell did not look back at the house. She fixed her eyes on the back of Colinet's shirt, on the sway of his horse's tail. As they left the road and struck out across the open scrubland, the world opened up. The familiar landmarks fell behind them. The air grew hotter, drier. The wind kicked up dust devils that danced across the plain like restless spirits. Nell felt a profound sense of dislocation. The town, her father, her name, it all felt like a skin she had shed. She touched the bone necklace at her throat. It was real. The horse beneath her was real. The man riding ahead of her, leading her into the heart of a country she had been told was hell, was real. A sick twist of fear coiled in her stomach, sharp and cold, but beneath it, deeper down, was the strangest sensation. For the first time in her life, she was riding towards something, instead of just waiting for it to happen to her. The vast, terrifying sky stretched overhead, an endless blue dome that promised nothing and everything. Colinet glanced back over his shoulder. He checked to see if she was keeping up. His eyes met hers for a second. Then he turned back to the horizon. Nell took a breath of the dusty air, grit and sage filling her lungs. She kicked the mare forward. She would keep up. She would not let him see her falter. Not now. Not ever. The town vanished behind a rise in the land, and Eleanor Harper disappeared with it. Only the wife of Colinet remained, riding into the wild. The land that lay beyond the boundaries of the Harper Ranch was not merely a different place. It was a different world entirely, governed by laws of geology and weather that had no regard for human fragility. For the first 3 days, the journey was a blur of punishment. The sun was a hammer that never stopped striking. It beat down on Nell's shoulders, penetrated the fabric of her blue dress, and seemed to boil the moisture right out of her skin. They rode through a landscape that defied the softness of memory. To the north, the mountains rose like jagged teeth, purple and bruised against the blinding sky. Below them, the high desert was a vast, undulating ocean of sagebrush and mesquite, broken only by the skeletal fingers of ocotillo cactus. The dust was constant. It rose in plumes from the horse's hooves, coating Nell's throat, stinging her eyes, and settling into the creases of her clothes until she felt she was made of the earth itself. Nell's physical suffering was acute. She had ridden horses all her life, but never like this. The Apache did not stop for midday meals or tea. They rode with a relentless, fluid efficiency, covering ground at a pace that left Nell aching in every bone. Her lips cracked and bled in the dry wind. The skin on her nose peeled, her hands, gripping the reins hour after hour, blistered and then calloused over the raw flesh. Yet, she did not speak of it. When they stopped to water the horses at a muddy seep, she slid from her saddle, her legs trembling so violently she almost collapsed. She locked her knees, swallowed the groan that rose in her throat, and walked steadily to the water. She could feel the eyes of the warriors on her. They were waiting for her to break. They were waiting for the white woman to cry, to beg for rest, to demand comfort. She would not give them that satisfaction. She drank the murky water from her cupped hands, wiped her mouth with her sleeve, and remounted without a word. It was during these grueling days that the monolithic image of the Apache she had built in her mind began to fracture. She had expected cruelty. She had expected them to ride the horses to death and treat their own with the same hardness they showed their enemies. Instead, she saw a discipline that bordered on tenderness. When water was found, the horses drank first, then the elders, then the children. The warriors drank last. She watched a young man, whose face was painted with the fierce stripes of war, dismount and walk for miles so that an older woman, whose pony had gone lame, could ride. She saw them share scant rations of dried meat and berries with a meticulous fairness that shamed the greedy table manners she had seen in the saloons of Senado Creek. At night, the temperature plummeted. The heat of the day evaporated into the thin air. leaving a cold that bit through her wool coat. The sky was an obsidian dome crushed with stars. So bright and close, Nell felt she could reach up and cut her fingers on them. She slept apart from the main circle. It was an unspoken arrangement. Colane would point to a spot near a scrub oak or a sheltering rock, slightly removed from the communal fire. She would lay out her bedroll, wrapping herself tight in the blanket that smelled of wood smoke, horse sweat, and wild sage. Lying there, shivering until her body heat warmed the wool, she felt a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight on her chest. She could hear the low hum of conversation from the fire. They spoke in their own tongue, a language of guttural stops and flowing vowels that sounded like the wind moving through the canyons. Occasionally, someone would sing, a high, lonely sound that drifted up toward the stars. She was a ghost in their midst, a stranger who had traded her life for a truce. Colane respected the distance between them with a rigor that both frustrated and reassured her. He did not hover. He did not try to make conversation in the exhausted twilight. He moved around her with slow, deliberate motions, like a man trying not to startle a deer. He ensured she had food. He checked the cinches of her saddle himself, but he never touched her. His eyes would find hers across the firelight, dark and unreadable, acknowledging her presence before sliding away to watch the perimeter. It was on the fourth afternoon that the sky turned the color of a bruise. The wind died suddenly. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. The birds, which had been scarce to begin with, vanished. Colane shouted a command, his voice cutting through the stillness. The column of riders halted instantly. He pointed to the west. A wall of darkness was consuming the horizon. It was not rain, it was earth. A dust storm, massive and towering, was rolling across the plains, swallowing the mountains, the sun, and the world itself. "Cover your faces," Colane shouted in English, wheeling his horse toward her. "Get down!" Nell struggled with her horse. The mare, sensing the barometric drop, reared, her eyes rolling white with panic. Nell lost her stirrup. She clung to the pommel, but the horse twisted violently. Colane was there in a second. He launched himself from his own mount, grabbing her bridle with one hand and seizing Nell by the waist with the other. He hauled her from the saddle just as the wind hit. It arrived with a shriek that tore the air apart. The light was extinguished instantly, replaced by a swirling, choking blindness. Sand and grit scoured Nell's skin like sandpaper. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't see. Colane pulled her down into the lee of a rocky outcrop. He forced her into a crouch and wrapped his heavy buffalo hide cloak around both of them. "Stay down," he yelled over the roar of the wind. "Keep your mouth closed." The world disappeared. There was only the screaming wind and the suffocating darkness inside the cloak. Nell was pressed against him, her face buried in the rough wool of his shirt. She was shaking, terror seizing her muscles. Then she felt it. His arm was clamped firmly around her shoulders, holding her anchored to the ground. His other hand was pressed against the back of her head, shielding her from the flying debris. Beneath the noise of the storm, she could feel the steady, thudding rhythm of his heart against her cheek. He was solid. He was warm. In the midst of the chaos, he was the only thing that was real. Is it going to kill us?" she shouted, her voice muffled against his chest. Colane shifted, pulling the cloak tighter to seal out the dust. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble in his chest that she felt more than heard. "The mountain breathes. We must wait until it exhales." They stayed like that for what felt like hours. The heat inside the cloak rose. Nell became acutely aware of the scent of him, leather, smoke, and the musk of a man who lived in the open air. It was not unpleasant. It was earthy and strong. Her fear began to transmute into something else, a strange, heated awareness. She was pressed against the length of his body. She could feel the hard muscle of his thigh against hers, the rise and fall of his breathing. For a woman who had been raised to keep 3 feet of distance from any man who was not her father, the intimacy was shocking. Yet she did not pull away. She burrowed closer, seeking the protection of his strength. When the wind finally died down to a moan, The silence returned, thick with dust. Colonne threw back the cloak. The light was eerie. A dim, orange twilight filtered through the suspended grit. They were covered in a layer of fine red powder. Nell sat up, coughing. Her throat felt like it was lined with felt. She tried to stand, but her legs were numb. Colonne stood and offered her a hand. She took it. His grip was firm, pulling her up with effortless strength. "We must clear the horses' noses," he said, releasing her hand. "Then we drink." They took shelter in a narrow ravine to wait for the air to clear. Nell sat on a flat rock, her hands shaking as she reached for her canteen. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her weak. She fumbled with the cap, her fingers clumsy and trembling. "Let me," Colonne said. He stepped in front of her. He did not take the canteen away. Instead, he reached out and cupped his large, rough hands over hers, steadying them. "Drink slowly," he murmured. The dust tricks the throat. Nell froze. His hands were warm, calloused, and incredibly gentle. He guided the canteen to her lips. She took a sip, the water cool and sweet against the grit in her mouth. She looked up at him over the rim of the metal flask. His eyes were fixed on hers. The distance he had maintained for days had collapsed in the storm. He was standing close enough that she could count the eyelashes dusted with red sand. His thumb brushed against her wrist, a rhythmic, unconscious stroke. "Thank you," she whispered, lowering the canteen. He did not pull away immediately. His hands lingered over hers for a heartbeat too long, the contact electric. "You are strong, Eleanor," he said softly, using her full name for the first time. "The storm breaks the weak branches. You are still standing." He stepped back then, the mask of the leader sliding back into place. But the air between them had changed. The charge of the storm had not fully dissipated. 2 days later, they reached the stronghold. It was a place that did not appear on any army map. They rode through a labyrinth of canyons until the walls opened up to reveal a hidden valley. It was a natural fortress, ringed by sheer red cliffs that glowed like embers in the afternoon sun. A stream cut through the center of the valley, lined with cottonwoods that flashed gold and green. Scattered along the water were wickiups, dome-shaped shelters made of brush and canvas. Small fields of corn and squash struggled in the rocky soil, green patches of defiance against the desert. As the column rode in, the camp came alive. Dogs barked, children ran alongside the horses, and women looked up from their cooking fires. Nell felt the weight of their gaze. It was heavy with judgment. She kept her back straight, staring ahead. But she saw them. She saw the young women whispering behind their hands. She saw the warriors who had not ridden with Colonne standing with their arms crossed, their faces dark with suspicion. This was not a conquering army returning with spoils. This was a ragged band of survivors bringing home a stranger who looked like the enemy. Colonne signaled for her to dismount near a wickiup in the center of the camp. "This is my home," he said. "You will stay here." Before Nell could answer, a woman stepped out of the shelter. She was younger than Colonne, with the same high cheekbones and intelligent, watchful eyes. She carried a basket of corn, which she set down with a sharp thud. "This is Nateha," Colonne said. "My sister. She will show you the way of things." Nateha looked at Nell. Her expression was not hostile, but it was not warm. It was the look one gives a tool that might be useful or might break in the hand. "She does not speak Apache," Nateha said to her brother in English, her accent thick but understandable. "She is soft. She will burn in the sun." "She is my wife," Colonne said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Teach her." He turned and walked toward the council fire, leaving Nell standing alone with the woman. Nateha sighed, a sound of long-suffering patience. "Come," she said to Nell. "Standing there catches no rabbits. We have work." Nateha became Nell's anchor and her tormentor. She was a demanding teacher. She did not explain things twice. She taught Nell how to grind corn using the heavy mano stone until Nell's shoulders screamed in protest. She taught her which wood burned slow and which burned fast. She taught her the words for water, for fire, for hunger. Two, Nateha would say, pointing to the stream. Two, say it. Two, Nell repeated. Kon, Nateha said, pointing to the fire. Kon, through the monotony of the chores. Nateha began to weave a tapestry of history. She did not give speeches. She dropped facts like stones into a pool. My husband died at the river, she said one afternoon while they were scraping a deer hide. The soldiers said it was a battle. He was fishing. He had no gun. Another day, pointing to a scar on her arm. This was from the long walk. They made us walk to the place of bad water. The rocks cut our feet. If we stopped, they hit us. Nell listened. She soaked it in. The vague rumors of injustice she had heard in town were replaced by the sharp, specific details of suffering. She began to understand the anger she saw in the eyes of the men like Takon, a warrior who watched her with open hatred whenever she crossed the camp. One evening, a week after their arrival, Nell walked to the stream to wash the dust from her face. The sun was setting, painting the cliffs in shades of violet and blood orange. She knelt by the water, splashing the coolness onto her skin. When she looked up, Kolane was standing on the opposite bank. He crossed on the stepping stones, moving silently. He stood beside her, looking down at the water. Nateha says you work hard. He said, she is a hard teacher, Nell replied, wiping her hands on her apron. Kolane sat down on a large flat rock. He gestured for her to sit nearby. Do you regret it? He asked. The question was sudden, stripping away the pleasantries. Nell looked at him. She thought of her father's ranch, the dry well, the crushing debt. She thought of the fear she had felt every night. Then she looked at the camp behind her. It was poor. It was dangerous. She was an outsider, but she was alive, and she was awake in a way she had never been before. I am afraid, Nell admitted. I am afraid of the winter. I am afraid of the soldiers coming. I am afraid I will never fit in here. But do you regret coming? Kolane pressed, his dark eyes searching her face. Nell shook her head slowly. No, she said. If I had stayed, I would have been safe, but I would have watched you die. I would have watched Luke die, and I would have hated myself. Kolane looked away, toward the cliffs. I am glad, he said softly. The silence that stretched between them was not empty. It was filled with the humming of insects in the grass and the rush of the water. Nell watched him. She saw the way the tension held his shoulders, the constant vigilance that defined his life. But here, in the twilight, away from the eyes of his people, he seemed to exhale. She noticed the line of his throat, the strength of his forearms resting on his knees. A heat rose in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. She wondered what it would be like to touch him again, without the excuse of a storm. 2 nights later, the mood in the camp shifted. A hunting party returned with 2 elks. It was a windfall. The lean times were held at bay for a few days. Fresh meat was roasted over the great central fire. The smell was rich and intoxicating. Drums began to beat, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to align with Nell's own heartbeat. The people ate, and then they told stories. An elder stood by the fire, his voice rising and falling, acting out a tale of Coyote the Trickster. The children laughed. Even the warriors smiled. Nell sat on the periphery, eating a strip of roasted meat. She caught only fragments of the language, words for mountain, bear, foolish. But she understood the laughter. She understood the shared relief of survival. She felt a pang of longing to be inside the circle, truly inside it, not just a guest by the fire. Kolane sat near her, drinking from a cup of herbal tea. He seemed relaxed, his guard down for the first time since she had known him. As the night deepened, the families drifted away to their wickiups. The fire burned down to a bed of glowing red coals. The air grew cold, sharp with the scent of pine and impending frost. Nell pulled her shawl tighter. She should go to sleep, but she did not want to move. Kolane shifted. He moved from his spot on the log to the ground beside her, closer than he had ever sat before. She could feel the heat radiating from him, His thigh was inches from hers. The proximity was a subtle shock, sending a tingle down her spine. "They told good stories tonight," she said, her voice quiet. "They tell of how we came to be." Kolane said, "They tell us that we are made of this earth. That is why we cannot leave it. To go to the reservation is to become a ghost." "I understand that now." Nell said, "I didn't before." Kolane turned to look at her. The firelight danced in his eyes, making them look like pools of molten copper. "You see more than most. Eleanor, you have a brave heart." He said it simply, as a fact, not a compliment. Nell looked down, embarrassed by the praise. She reached out to adjust a log on the fire, trying to hide her face. As she moved, the log shifted, and a pocket of sap exploded. A spray of sparks flew up. One of them, a bright orange ember, landed on the tender skin of her inner wrist. Nell hissed in pain and jerked her hand back. Kolane moved instantly. He caught her hand in his. "Be still," he commanded gently. He brought her wrist up to his face. He didn't brush the ash away roughly. Instead, he blew on the burn, a cool, steady stream of air. The sensation was shocking. His breath was cool on her skin, but his hands were hot. He held her wrist with a firmness that was possessive, yet careful. Nell froze. She watched his face, bent over her hand. She saw the curve of his lips, the dark sweep of his hair. The pain of the burn vanished, replaced by a thundering in her chest. Her heart was racing, hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Kolane stopped blowing. He did not let go of her hand. He looked up, his face inches from hers. "Is it better?" he whispered. Nell couldn't speak. She could only nod. He looked at her mouth, then he looked at her eyes. The air between them was pulled tight, vibrating with the unspoken. The desire that had been a low hum was now a roar in her ears. He ran his thumb over the pulse point of her wrist. He must have felt how fast it was beating. "You are trembling," he said. "I am cold." Nell lied, her voice breathless. Kolane's eyes darkened. He knew it was a lie. "Then come closer to the fire," he said. He did not pull her. He waited. Nell moved. She shifted her weight, leaning imperceptibly toward him. It was a surrender. It was an admission. Kolane released her hand slowly, letting his fingers trail against her palm as he pulled away. The loss of contact was a physical ache. "Go to sleep, Eleanor," he said, his voice rough, "before the fire goes out." Nell stood up on shaking legs. She walked to her sleeping place, her wrist still tingling where his lips had been near. She lay down in the dark, staring at the canvas roof of the wickiup, listening to the wind and knowing that the safety of distance was gone forever. The season turned with the slow, inevitable grinding of the earth. The relentless heat of late summer broke, giving way to an autumn that painted the high country in startling brilliance. The cottonwoods along the stream turned a vibrant, shaking gold, standing like torches against the red cliff walls. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of pine pitch and wood smoke, and the mornings brought a rim of frost to the water bucket that Nell had to break with a stone before she could wash. Time was no longer measured in hours or the ticking of a clock on a mantelpiece. It was measured in the sun's arc, the length of the shadows, and the daily struggle for calories. Nell's hands, once raw and blistered, had hardened. Her palms were calloused, her fingernails cut short and stained with the dye of walnuts and the dust of the grinding stone. She had learned to scrape a hide without tearing it, a task that made her arms ache and her stomach churn at the smell of raw flesh. But she did it until Nateja nodded in silent approval. She learned to spot the difference between the edible roots and the poisonous ones, and she learned that silence was often a better answer than speech. She had earned a place. It was a small place, fragile and contested, but it was hers. When she walked to the stream to fetch water, the children no longer stopped their games to stare at her with wide, fearful eyes. Some of the women would nod as she passed, a subtle acknowledgement that she was pulling her weight. She was no longer just the white stranger. She was the woman who carried the water, the woman who mended the shirts, the woman who sat by the fire, But her relationship with Colonne was the axis upon which her world turned. It grew in the quiet spaces, in the moments between the hard work of survival. It happened on the long rides when the band moved to follow the game. Colonne would ride at the head of the column, his eyes scanning the horizon for soldiers or rival bands. But he always circled back. He would check the cinch of her saddle, his hands moving with practiced ease near her leg, his knuckles brushing the denim of her skirt. He would offer her his canteen before he drank himself, watching her throat as she swallowed, his gaze intense and unreadable. One afternoon, while they rested in a grove of scrub oak, Nell sat repairing a tear in his vest. He sat nearby, sharpening his knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic shh of the stone was hypnotic. "My mother used to sew like that," Colonne said suddenly. He did not look up from the blade. She had quick hands. Nell paused, the needle hovering over the leather. "You never speak of her. She died when I was young." He said, "The fever took her, but I remember she hummed when she worked." "You do not hum." "Eleanor, you frown." Nell felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She looked down at her work. "I am concentrating," she said. "I do not want to make a mess of it." "You could not make a mess of it," Colonne said. His voice dropped, losing the command tone he used with the warriors. It became the voice of a man speaking to a woman. "You bring order to things." He looked up then, and the expression in his eyes made Nell's breath hitch. It was a look of profound recognition. He saw her. He did not see a political pawn or a white burden. He saw her, and in that look, Nell felt a terrifying thrill, a realization that she was no longer staying for the peace treaty. She was staying for him. However, the camp was not a monolith. For every nod of respect Nell earned, there was a scowl of resentment. The center of this hostility was Takon. Takon was a warrior of 30 winters, lean and scarred, with eyes that burned with a fanatic's light. He had lost his wife and 2 daughters to a cavalry raid 3 years prior, and his grief had calcified into a hatred that admitted no nuance. To him, Nell was not a woman. She was a symbol of their capitulation. He saw Colonne's strategy not as wisdom, but as weakness. Nell felt Tahakon's eyes on her constantly. When she walked through the camp, he would spit on the ground. When she sat at the council fire, he would turn his back. He gathered men around him, young, angry braves who chafed at the restrictions Colonne placed on raiding. They whispered in the shadows, their voices sharp with dissent. One evening, a scout rode into camp. His horse frothed with sweat. The news he brought was like a stone dropped into a still pond. The army was moving. General Crook was pressuring the bands to the north, forcing them onto the reservation at San Carlos. Those who refused were being hunted, but the scout brought other news that he delivered while glancing sideways at Nell. "Your father speaks loud in the settlements," the scout said, translating for Nell's benefit at Colonne's insistence. "He tells the newspapers in Tucson that you were stolen. He says you are a captive, held in chains. He says he will not rest until every Apache is dead and you are returned." The words struck Nell like a physical blow. She sat by the fire, the blood draining from her face. "He knows that is a lie." Nell whispered, I told him I chose this." The scout shrugged. "The truth does not sell newspapers. The truth does not bring soldiers. He stirs the anger. He uses your name to call for war." Nell looked across the fire at Colonne. His face was a mask of stone, but she saw the muscle in his jaw jump. Her father was using her love, her sacrifice, as a weapon to destroy the very people she had tried to save. She felt a wave of nausea. She was the excuse. Her presence here, meant to be a shield, had been twisted into a target. "I must go to him," Nell said, standing up. "If I go to the fort, if I tell them, sit down." Takon snapped from across the circle. His English was broken and harsh. "You go. You lead them here. You leave a trail. You are the bait in the trap." Colonne raised a hand, silencing Takon. "She does not go," Colonne said firmly. "If she leaves this canyon, the soldiers will take her. They will say we abused her. They will say her mind is broken. They will not listen to her words." He looked at Nell, his eyes sad. "Your father has made his choice." Eleanor, he values his hate more than your truth. The realization settled over Nell, heavy and suffocating. She was truly an orphan now. Her old life had not just rejected her, it was trying to consume her new one. She felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of Takon. She sat down, pulling her shawl tight, feeling the isolation close in around her. The tension in the camp grew with the moon. A council was called 3 nights later. The elders argued late into the night. The smoke from the pipe hung thick in the air, swirling with the heated words. Takon argued for a preemptive strike, for raiding the settlements before the snows came. The elders argued for evasion, for moving deep into the Sierra Madre where the horses of the army could not follow. Colonel sat in the center, listening. He looked exhausted. The burden of leadership, of holding together a fraying people, was etching deep lines into his face. He looked at Takon, then at the elders, then at Nell, who sat in the shadows of the women's circle. Enough, Colonel said finally, standing up. We do not raid. We do not give them the excuse they want. We prepare to move. We go south. He turned and walked out of the council ring, into the darkness. Nell hesitated only a moment. She stood and followed him. She found him on a high ridge overlooking the valley. The campfires below looked like fallen stars, mirroring the vast, glittering expanse of the Milky Way above. The wind up here was cold, biting through her layers. But Colonel stood with his chest bare to the night, as if he welcomed the chill. He did not turn when she approached. He knew her step. They want blood, he said quietly. Takon wants to wash his grief in it. He thinks I am weak because I do not give it to him. He is wrong, Nell said. She stepped up beside him. You are the only thing keeping them alive. Colonel turned to look at her. The starlight silvered the planes of his face. And you, he asked, what am I keeping you from? Everything, Nell said. You are keeping me from a life that was suffocating me. Colonel let out a long breath, a plume of white in the dark air. I have tried to be honorable. Eleanor, I have tried to keep the promise I made to myself. I told myself I would not touch you until you were truly one of us. I told myself I would not take what was not freely given. He took a step closer. The space between them seemed to charge with electricity. But it is hard, he whispered. It is the hardest thing I have ever done, to sleep 10 paces from you, to watch the wind in your hair and keep my hands at my sides. Nell's heart began to hammer against her ribs. The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. This was not the stoic leader. This was the man beneath the paint. I have thought of you too, Nell confessed, her voice barely a whisper, at night. When the fire dies down, I think about your hands. I think about how you held me in the storm. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and honest. I was afraid of you once. Nell said, I was afraid of everything out here, but I am not afraid of you anymore. I am only afraid of losing you. Colonel reached out. His hand trembled slightly as he touched her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his skin rough and warm against hers. You are dangerous, he murmured. More dangerous than the soldiers. You make me want to live. Eleanor, and a warrior who wants to live is afraid to die. He lowered his forehead until it rested against hers. She could feel his breath on her skin. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, sage, smoke, and man. Tell me when to stop, he said. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating through her. The question hung there. It was the final barrier. He was giving her the power. He was giving her the choice to walk away, to keep this a political arrangement, to protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak of their world. Nell opened her eyes. She looked into the dark depths of his. I won't, she said softly. The words were a surrender, but they were also a victory. She was choosing this. She was choosing him. Colonel let out a sound that was half groan, half prayer. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against him with a sudden, fierce desperation. His mouth found hers. It was not a tentative kiss. It was a claiming. It was hungry and deep. born of months of repression and fear. Nell wound her arms around his neck, burying her hands in his hair. She pressed herself against him, feeling the hard wall of his chest, the strength of his arms encasing her. The cold wind vanished. The camp below vanished. There was only the heat of his skin, the taste of him, the overwhelming reality of his body against hers. He kissed her cheeks, her throat, the hollow of her neck, murmuring words in Apache that she did not need to translate to understand. They were words of worship. They sank down onto the buffalo robe he had spread on the rocks, under the vast, indifferent sky, amidst a world that wanted them dead. They found a desperate, consuming life in each other. It was an act of defiance. It was a sealing of the bond that went deeper than blood or treaties. When they returned to the camp just before dawn, nothing was said. But everything had changed. There was a shift in the way they moved together. They walked shoulder to shoulder. When Colonel spoke to her, his voice held a new resonance, a quiet intimacy that excluded the rest of the world. But secrets in a camp of 50 people are impossible to keep. The way Nell looked at him, the way his hand lingered on her back, it was noticed. The whispers began immediately. "He is bewitched," the old women muttered as they ground the corn. "She has put a spell on him. He forgets his duty." Takon watched with narrowing eyes. He saw the softness in Colonel's face. He saw the way the leader lingered at the wickiup in the mornings instead of riding out with the dawn patrol. To Takon, this was not love. It was treason. It was proof that the white woman was a poison that was slowly killing the warrior spirit of their leader. "We are vulnerable," Takon hissed to his followers by the horse herd. "He thinks only of her. He does not see the knife at our throats." And the knife was getting closer. 2 days later, the outriders came galloping in. They had spotted dust columns to the east. Not a full regiment, but a large posse, maybe 40 men. They were moving fast, tracking the band sign with disturbing accuracy. "They have scouts," the outrider reported, breathing hard. "And they have settlers with them, men who know the land." Nell felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. Luke, her brother, was out there. He was leading them. He was coming to rescue her. And he would kill the man she loved to do it. Colonel stood by the fire, the softness of the previous nights gone. He was the war chief again. He looked at the horizon, calculating. "We cannot fight them here," he said. "We are too exposed. And if we fight, the army will hear the guns and bring the cannons." "We must move," Nell said. Her voice was steady. She stood beside him, and, for the first time, she did not feel like an interloper in the council. She felt like a partner. "We can go to the Dragoon stronghold. The water's good there. They cannot bring wagons up those trails." Takon sneered. "Listen to her. She tells us where to hide. She leads us into a box canyon so her father can shoot us like rabbits." "No," Colonel said sharply. "She is right. The south trail is hard, but it is safe. We leave at dusk. We will travel by night." The camp exploded into activity. Women began packing the wickiups, strapping bundles to the travois. The men rounded up the horses. There was a frantic energy, a smell of fear and determination. Colonel pulled Nell aside. "Stay close to me," he said, gripping her arm. "If the fighting starts, you do not stop. You ride for the high rocks. Do you understand? I am not leaving you," Nell said fiercely. "You will do as I say," Colonel said, his eyes blazing. "I can fight 10 men. I cannot fight if I am looking over my shoulder to see if you are safe." Nell swallowed hard. "I understand." Hope flickered in the camp. The plan was solid. If they could make the pass by midnight, they would lose the pursuers in the maze of rock. They could vanish into the deep mountains where the white men feared to tread. They could be safe. But they did not know about the shadow moving through the camp. As the sun dipped below the rim of the canyon, casting long purple shadows across the valley, Takon slipped away. He did not take his horse. The noise would alert the sentries. He moved on foot, slipping between the rocks like a snake. He carried his rifle, but he did not intend to fire it. He intended to talk. He made his way up a narrow goat path, cresting the ridge and dropping down the other side. He moved toward the dust cloud he had seen earlier. He knew where the soldiers would camp. Takon told himself he was a patriot. He told himself he was saving his people from a leader who had lost his mind. He told himself that the white woman was a disease that had to be cut out. He reached the soldiers' bivouac an hour after dark. He walked into the firelight with his hands up. "Don't shoot," he called out in English. "I have words for the captain." Luke Harper, sitting by the fire with a Winchester across his knees, jumped up. He looked older, harder than the boy Nell had left. His eyes were rimmed with red. "It's one of them," Luke shouted, raising the rifle. "Hold fire," Captain Hayes ordered. Khan stood in the light. He looked at the white men. He looked at the guns, the horses, the power. He hated them, but he hated what Colonel had become even more. "I know where he is," Khan said, his voice flat. "I know where he goes tonight." "What do you want?" Hayes asked, stepping forward. "I want the band left alone." Khan said, "I will give you Colonel, and I will give you the woman, but the rest, you let the rest go." Hayes looked at Luke. Luke looked at Khan, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. "You give me my sister," Luke said, his voice trembling. "And you can have whatever you want." Khan nodded. "They move south at moonrise," he said, "through the narrow pass at Blind Man's Rock. If you wait there, you will catch them all." The deal was struck. The betrayal was complete. Back in the valley, Nell tightened the cinch on her mare, looking at Colane with a heart full of love and fear, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already been sold. The dawn did not break gently over the valley that morning. It arrived as a pale, sickly gray light that barely penetrated the shadows of the canyon floor. The air was cold and still, holding the scent of damp sage and the lingering smoke of the dying campfires. Nell was awake before the sun. She lay wrapped in her buffalo robe, watching the breath mist in front of her face. Beside her, Colane slept with the light, fitful rest of a man who expects danger even in his dreams. His hand rested on the stock of his carbine. The silence was shattered not by a bugle, but by the crack of a single rifle shot that echoed off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. Colane was on his feet instantly, pulling Nell up with him. Before she could ask what was happening, the world exploded. From the rim of the canyon, muzzle flashes sparked like fireflies in the gloom. A hail of lead rained down on the sleeping camp. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of gunfire that bounced and magnified against the red rock cliffs until it felt as if the earth itself were screaming. "Down!" Colane shouted, shoving Nell behind a stack of supplies. Chaos erupted in the wiki-ups. Women screamed, grabbing children who were still half asleep. Elders stumbled out into the open, confused and terrified, only to be cut down before they could take 3 steps. The horses in the makeshift corral screamed, rearing and kicking, tearing down the brush fence and stampeding through the center of the camp, adding the thunder of hooves to the cacophony of death. It was a slaughter. The attackers had the high ground, and they were firing blindly into the bowl of the valley. Bullets struck the rocky ground, whining as they ricocheted, sending deadly shards of stone flying through the air. Dust rose in choking clouds, mixing with the gunpowder smoke to turn the dawn into a blinding, gritty fog. Khan ran into the center of the camp, waving his arms. He was shouting, his face twisted in shock. "Stop!" he screamed in English, looking up at the ridge. "Stop! We surrender! The deal! The deal!" He thought he could control the storm he had summoned. He thought Captain Hayes and the settlers wanted a negotiation. But the men on the ridge were not interested in deals. They were interested in vengeance. A bullet struck the dirt inches from Khan's foot, and another clipped his shoulder, spinning him around. He stared up at the invisible shooters, the realization of his betrayal crashing down on him. They did not care about his help. To them, he was just another target. Nell peered over the crates, coughing in the dust. Through the haze, she saw a young mother, a girl named Esha, who had only just started smiling at Nell a week ago, running toward the stream with her baby pressed to her chest. "Esha!" Nell screamed. "No!" A bullet caught the young mother in the back. She fell forward, curling her body around the infant as she hit the ground. She did not move again. The baby's wail rose thin and high over the gunfire. Nell felt a sickness rise in her throat, hot and acidic. This was not war. This was not a battle between soldiers. This was murder. She saw Nateja trying to herd a group of elders toward the shelter of the cliff overhang. Nateja was fierce, shouting commands, pushing the slow-moving old ones forward. Suddenly, Nateja stumbled, clutching her thigh. Blood bloomed dark against her buckskin skirt. She fell to one knee but dragged herself back up, refusing to leave the elders behind. Any illusion Nell had held about the nobility of her own people, about the civilized justice of the United States Army, shredded in that moment. The men on the ridge, men she might have known, men who bought flour at the mercantile, were shooting women and children in a box canyon. "We must go!" Colonel's voice was in her ear. He was firing back, his face grim and set in lines of iron. He was not firing wildly. Every shot he took was calculated to suppress the attackers on the lower ridge, buying seconds for his people. He grabbed Nell's arm. "The cleft! Go to the cleft!" He pointed toward a fissure in the canyon wall. A narrow, shadowed crack behind a screen of mesquite that only the band knew about. It was a steep, treacherous chimney that led up to the high plateau. "Run!" he commanded. "I will cover you!" Nell scrambled to her feet. The air was thick with lead. She could hear the bullets buzzing past her like angry hornets. She ran toward the cliff, bending low. "Eleanor!" The voice cut through the din, familiar and terrifying. Nell froze for a fraction of a second. She looked toward the mouth of the valley. Thomas Harper was riding into the camp, flanked by blue-coated soldiers. He was not on the ridge. He had ridden in with the ground force. His face was red with exertion and fury. He held a pistol in one hand, scanning the chaos. "Eleanor," Thomas roared, "come to me. You are safe." A soldier near him spotted her. "There she is," he shouted. "We found her." The soldier spurred his horse toward her, a grin on his face. He thought he was the hero of the story. He thought he was rescuing the damsel from the dragon. Nell looked at the soldier. Then she looked at her father. Thomas was reaching out his hand, his eyes wild with a possessive desperation. "Come here, girl," Thomas shouted. "Run to me." Nell looked at them, and then she looked down. A child of 5 or 6 years, a little girl with wide, terrified eyes, was frozen near a burning wickiup, too scared to move. Nell made her choice. It was not a choice of words, but of action. She turned her back on her father. She turned her back on the army, on the town, on the safety they promised. She lunged for the child, grabbing the little girl's arm. "Come on!" Nell screamed over the roar of the fire. She hauled the child up and ran, not toward Thomas, but away from him. She ran toward the jagged dark line of the cleft, deeper into the Apache stronghold. Thomas Harper watched his daughter run. He saw her grab the Indian child. He saw her turn away from his outstretched hand as if he were the devil himself. His arm dropped. His face crumpled, the rage draining away to leave a raw, gaping heartbreak that quickly hardened into a cold, toxic hate. She was not running from captors. She was running with them. "Get her!" Thomas screamed, his voice breaking. "Get her back!" But Nell and the child had vanished into the smoke near the cliff wall. Near the entrance to the cleft, Colonel was holding the line. He fired, levered the action, and fired again. He saw Nell make it to the shadows. Relief washed over him, followed instantly by a fresh wave of violence. Takon stumbled toward the cleft, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He saw Colonel reloading. "You!" Takon spat, blood flecking his lips. "You made us soft. You brought this on us." Takon raised his knife, his eyes mad with pain and betrayal. He lunged at Colane, blaming the leader for the treachery of the white men. Colane sidestepped, catching Takon's wrist, but he did not have to strike. A shot rang out from the soldiers advancing through the smoke. Takon stiffened. A red stain spread across the center of his chest. He looked at Colane, his eyes clearing for a brief, terrible moment. "They lied," Takon whispered. He collapsed into the dust, dead before he hit the ground. Colane looked at the fallen warrior, a man who had been his friend, then his rival, and finally, a victim of his own hope. There was no time to mourn. "Go!" Colane shouted to the remaining warriors. Up the rock. He turned and followed Nell into the fissure. The cleft was a nightmare of vertical rock and choking dust. It was barely wide enough for a horse, and they had to leave the animals behind. The survivors scrambled up the steep slope on hands and knees, pulling themselves over boulders, gasping for air. Nell pushed the little girl ahead of her. Her hands were scraped raw against the sandstone. Her lungs burned. Below them, the sounds of the massacre continued. The shouting of the soldiers, the screaming of the dying horses, the crackling of the fires consuming their home. They climbed until their muscles seized. They climbed until the sounds of the valley faded into a dull, distant roar. When they finally emerged onto the high plateau, the sun had fully risen. It was a different world up here. The wind whipped across the flat, exposed rock, cold and merciless. There was no water. There was no shelter, just miles of scrub and stone stretching out under a blindingly bright sky. The group that collapsed onto the hard earth was small. Kolane, Nell, Nateha, 3 elders, 4 warriors, and 2 children. That was all. 50 people had gone to sleep in the valley. 12 stood on the plateau. Nell fell to her knees, her chest heaving. She looked at the group. They were covered in gray dust and bright blood. They looked like statues carved from grief. Nateha was sitting against a rock, her face pale, pressing a piece of cloth to her thigh. The blood was seeping through her fingers. Nell crawled over to her. "Let me see," she gasped. Nateha moved her hand. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of the outer thigh. It was a clean hole, but it was bleeding heavily. Nell looked down at her blue dress, the dress she had been married in, the dress that marked her as a white woman. She grabbed the hem and ripped it. The sound of the tearing fabric was loud in the silence. She ripped it again and again, tearing long strips of cotton from the skirt until she was left in her shift and petticoats. She bound Nateha's leg, pulling the knot tight. Nateha hissed in pain but gripped Nell's shoulder. "Good," Nateha whispered. Her eyes squeezed shut. "Good knot." Nell moved to the next wounded elder. Her hands were shaking violently, trembling with the adrenaline crash, but she forced them to work. She wiped blood from a warrior's forehead. She checked the little girl for injuries. As she worked, the tears began to come. She did not wail. She sobbed quietly, a continuous shuddering sound that she could not stop. The images of the valley, Esha falling, the baby screaming, the look on her father's face, played over and over in her mind. Kolane stood at the edge of the plateau, looking back down toward the canyon. He was bruised, his shirt torn, a graze from a bullet bleeding sluggishly on his arm. He held his rifle in a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He did not look like a chief. He looked like a man whose soul had been hollowed out. "I did not see it," he said, his voice flat and dead. "Takon, the soldiers! I should have known." He turned to look at the survivors. He saw the blood. He saw the few faces left. "I led them into a trap," he whispered. "I tried to save them with peace, and I bought them death." Nell finished binding the elder's arm. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and walked to Kolane. She reached out and took his hand. It was cold and covered in gunpowder. "No," she said fiercely, though her voice shook. "Takon made a choice. The soldiers made a choice. You fought for them." Kolane looked at her. His eyes were haunted, filled with a guilt so crushing it threatened to break him. "I brought a white woman into the camp," he said. "I drew the anger to us." Nell squeezed his hand. "You brought me," she said, "and I'm still here. We are still here." She gestured to the vast, empty plateau. "We have to move. Kolane, if we stay here, they will find a way up. We have to move." Kolane looked at her. He saw the tears tracking through the dust on her face, the blood on her hands that was not hers. He saw the steel in her spine. She was right. There was no time for guilt. There was only survival. He nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. "Yes," he said. "We go north, to the Badlands. They cannot follow there." The trek that followed was a descent into hell. They walked for days across a landscape that seemed designed to kill humans. The sun beat down on the exposed rock, baking the plateau until the air shimmered. There was no water. They sucked on pebbles to keep the saliva in their mouths. Their lips cracked and bled. Nell's boots, made for the ranch yard, began to fall apart. The sharp rocks cut through the leather soles. Her feet bled, leaving small dark spots on the stone that dried instantly. She did not complain. She could not. Colonel walked at the rear, carrying the smallest child, his eyes constantly scanning their back trail. He gave his ration of water, what little they carried in the few canteens they had saved, to the wounded. He did not sleep. That first night, they sheltered in a jagged ravine, huddled under a rock overhang that offered scant protection from the wind that howled across the high ground. They had no fire. A fire would be a beacon to the soldiers. They huddled together for warmth, a pile of shivering bodies. Nell and Colonel sat slightly apart, sharing a single thin wool blanket. The cold was biting. Nell shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. Colonel pulled her against him. He wrapped his arms around her, tucking her head under his chin. He was warm, a furnace against the chill. "I am sorry," he whispered into her hair. The words were a broken refrain. "I am sorry. Eleanor—" Nell rested her head against his chest. She listened to the slow, steady thud of his heart. It was the only thing that anchored her to the earth. "Do not say it," she whispered back. "I promised you a life," he said bitterly. "I did not promise you this. You could be in a warm bed. You could be safe." Nell pulled back slightly so she could see his face in the gloom. "I was in a warm bed," she said, "and I was half dead." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the bruise on his cheekbone. "I chose this. Colonel. When I ran from my father, when I grabbed that child, I chose, I am not a captive, I am your wife, and I am Apache." The word hung in the air between them. It was a claim she had no right to by blood, but had earned by fire. Colonel looked at her with a mixture of wonder and agony. He leaned his forehead against hers. "We are alive," he breathed. "Yes," Nell said. "We are alive." She kissed him then, a desperate, salty kiss that tasted of dust and grief. It was an affirmation. It was a defiance of the death that stalked them. In the dark, under the rock, their bodies pressed together not just for warmth, but to prove that they still existed, that they had not been erased. The days blurred into a haze of suffering. Hunger became a constant, gnawing companion. They ate lizards they caught on the rocks. They ate the roots of cactus. They moved like ghosts, placing their feet carefully to avoid leaving tracks. Nell found a strength she did not know she possessed. When the elders faltered, she was there. "Come," she would say, offering her shoulder. "Just to that rock. We rest at that rock." She took charge of the water. It was a thankless, terrible task to deny a crying child a drink. But she did it. "Sip," she commanded, holding the canteen. "Just a sip. We need it for tomorrow." The survivors watched her. The suspicion in their eyes began to fade, replaced by a dull, weary respect. She suffered as they suffered. She bled as they bled. She did not ask for more than her share. On the 5th day, they met a pair of wandering Navajo sheep herders in a remote canyon. The encounter was tense, weapons drawn, until Colonel spoke the sign language of the plains. The herders gave them a little dried mutton and news. The news was bitter. "The army claims a great victory," the herder told them, his eyes sliding to Nell. "They say they destroyed the band of the renegade Colonel. They say they captured 50 hostiles." "And the woman?" Colonel asked. The herder hesitated. "They say the white woman was seen running into the caves, dragged by the savages." He said, "They say her father is offering $1,000 for her return. They say she is being held against her will and tortured." Nell closed her eyes. The lie was complete. Her father had rewritten history to save his pride. To the world. She was a victim. To the world. Her choice did not exist. They marched on. The lies stung, but they also clarified everything. Nell looked at the small, battered group of survivors stumbling through the dust. She looked at Colonel, who was lifting Nateja over a fallen log. The world out there, the world of newspapers and forts and ranch houses, was a world of paper and ink. It was a world of stories men told to make themselves feel righteous. This, here on the rocks, was the truth. The hunger was truth. The blood was truth. The hand of the man she loved gripping hers as they climbed the next rise was truth. Nell opened her eyes and looked at the horizon. "Let them talk," she said to the wind. She adjusted the makeshift bandage on her foot, stood up, and walked to the front of the line to stand beside her husband. "We walk," she said to him. Kolane looked at her. He saw the iron in her soul. He nodded. "We walk." They turned their faces to the north, toward the Badlands, and stepped forward into the unforgiving vastness of their future. The hidden valley lay nestled in the spine of the high mountains, a place the old stories called the breath of the spirits. To reach it, the survivors had climbed until their lungs burned in the thin air, navigating a goat trail that hung precariously over drops of 1,000 feet. But when they crested the final ridge, the land opened up into a bowl of startling, savage beauty. It was a place of deep greens and stark grays. A stream, fed by the eternal snows of the peaks, cut through the center, the water so clear and cold it made the teeth ache to drink it. Towering ponderosa pines stood like sentinels, their needles hushing the wind. The soil was thin and rocky, demanding back-breaking labor to yield even a modest harvest. And the shadows of the peaks lengthened early in the afternoon, promising winters that would be long, dark, and burying. It was a fortress made by the hand of the Almighty. Here, the army wagons could not come. The heavy cannons could not be dragged up the scree slopes. It was safe, but safety had a flavor. And for the 12 survivors, it tasted like ash. They set up a temporary camp near the water. There were no songs that first night. They huddled by small fires, the silence of the high country pressing in on them. They were alive, but they were a stump of a people. The rest, the mothers, the brothers, the children like Esha's baby, were gone. They were either dead in the canyon below or being marched in chains to the reservation, a place the Apache spoke of with the same dread Christians reserved for purgatory. Kolane walked the perimeter of the camp, his limp pronounced from the strain of the climb. He looked at the few faces illuminated by the firelight. He saw Nateha, her leg bound in rags, trying to comfort an orphan. He saw the hollow cheeks of the elders. The guilt that had ridden him since the massacre had hardened into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He came to the fire where Nell sat mending a moccasin with a bone needle. He stood over her, his shadow long. "We cannot stay here," he said. Nell looked up. The firelight caught the sharp angles of her face, stripped of all softness by the weeks of starvation and flight. "We cannot leave," she said quietly. "The snows will close the pass in a month. If we go back down, we die. I will not sit here and watch the snow fall while my people rot in the cages of the white men," Kolane said. His voice was rough, vibrating with a fury he was barely containing. "I will take the warriors. We will go back. We will raid the reservation. We will cut the wire and bring them out." Nateha looked up from across the fire. "You have 4 warriors, brother," she said. "The fort has 400 soldiers. That is not a rescue. That is a suicide. It is better to die fighting than to live knowing we left them." Kolane snapped. The debate raged late into the night. It was a raw, agonizing tearing at the soul of the group. The warriors, burning with shame, wanted to fight. They wanted to ride down in a blaze of glory, to wash away the memory of their flight in blood. The elders, tired and broken, wept silently. They knew that to go back was death, but to stay was a betrayal of their kin. Nell sat and listened. She felt the pull of Kolane's logic. She felt the ache in her own chest for the people she had come to know. But she also saw the reality. If Kolane rode down there, he would die, and the flame of his people, this small, stubborn spark they had carried up the mountain, would be extinguished forever. She stood up. The movement was sudden enough to silence the men. "There is another way," she said. Kolane looked at her, his eyes dark and skeptical. "There is no other way." Eleanor, they do not trade for Apache. They only kill or capture. They do not trade for Apache. Nell agreed, her voice steady. But they might trade for me. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind sighed through the pine boughs. A lonely sound. Nell walked around the fire until she stood before her husband. I am not just the wife of Colonel, she said. I am Eleanor Harper. I am the daughter of Thomas Harper. I am the white woman the newspapers say was stolen. If I walk into that fort, they have to listen to me. No, Colonel said immediately. It was a guttural rejection. You do not go back. I go back to negotiate. Nell pressed. I go back to tell the truth. I will tell them that I was not stolen. I will tell them that the army slaughtered women and children. I will threaten to tell that story to every newspaper in the territory unless they make a deal. And what deal is that? Nateha asked. Her voice hushed. We offer them a peace they can brag about, Nell said. We tell them the raiding stops. We tell them the war is over. In exchange, they release the captives to us. They let us live here, in the high country. And they leave us alone. Colonel grabbed her shoulders. His grip was hard, bruising. You think they will let you walk out again? He hissed. You think your father will let you leave? They will lock you in a room. They will say you are mad. I will never see you again. I am not the girl who left that ranch, Nell said, looking into his eyes. I am stronger than they are. Colonel, and I know them. They are tired. Captain Hayes is tired. They want an end to this as much as we do. It is a trap, Colonel said, shaking her. I will not let you do it. I will not send you into the den of the wolves. Then you choose death, Nell said, her voice dropping to a whisper. If you raid, you die. If we stay and do nothing, the spirit of this band dies. This is the only path that leads to life. She pulled away from him and walked into the darkness of the trees. Colonel stood by the fire, his chest heaving. He looked at Nateha. His sister looked back at him, her eyes sad and knowing. She has the heart of a war chief, Nateha said softly. She is right, brother. Colonel found Nell an hour later by the stream. She was sitting on a boulder, hugging her knees against the biting cold. The water rushed past, black and hurried. He stood behind her for a long time before he spoke. I hate this, he said. I know. Nell answered without turning. He sat down beside her. He did not touch her at first. He picked up a stone and threw it into the water. When I took you from the ranch, he said, I thought I was taking a hostage. Then I thought I was taking a wife. Now I fear I am sending my heart down the mountain to be eaten. Nell turned to him. She took his cold hand in both of hers. You are not sending me, she said. I am going. I am choosing to fight with the only weapon I have. You fight with a rifle. I fight with my name. Colonel looked at her. He saw the resolve in her jaw, the same stubborn set he had seen the day she refused to run to the soldiers in the burning valley. He realized then that he could not forbid her. To lock her in this valley would be to do exactly what her father had tried to do, to own her, to decide her fate. He raised his hand and cupped her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. If you do not come back, he whispered, his voice cracking, I will burn the territory down. I will leave nothing standing. I will come back, Nell promised. They held each other then. It was not a gentle embrace. It was a clinging, desperate thing. They breathed each other in, memorizing the scent of skin and pine, the feel of the pulse beneath the surface. They made quiet vows against the cold skin of each other's necks, promises that defied the logic of the frontier. Nell left 2 days later. She did not ride alone. Colonel and the 4 remaining warriors escorted her down the treacherous trail. Stopping a mile from the fort, they would wait in the rocks. If she did not return by sunset on the second day, they would attack. It was a futile plan, but it was the only one they had. Nell rode the last mile alone. She wore a dress of buckskin that Nateha had sewn for her, but she wore her bone necklace openly. Her hair was braided in the Apache style. She rode straight toward the gates of Fort Gannon, her back straight, her eyes fixed forward. The sentry on the wall saw her coming. He squinted against the sun, then lowered his rifle in disbelief. "Open the gate!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "It's her. It's the Harper girl." Nell rode into the courtyard. The fort was a swirl of dust and activity. Soldiers stopped their drilling. Laundresses paused over their tubs. A silence rippled outward from her horse until the entire parade ground was still. She did not dismount. She sat on her mare, looking down at them. She saw the shock in their faces. They had expected a broken thing, a woman ravaged and weeping. Instead, they saw a woman who sat a horse like a queen, whose skin was brown from the sun, and whose eyes held no fear. "Eleanor?" The voice came from the steps of the command post. Thomas Harper stood there. He looked 10 years older than when she had last seen him. His hair was entirely white. He held a hat in his hands, crushing the brim. Nell looked at her father. She felt a pang of pity, but it was distant, like looking at a stranger. "Hello, Pa," she said. Thomas ran down the steps. He reached for her bridle, his hands shaking. "My God," he wept. "My God, you're alive. When you ran, we thought they had drugged you. Get down. Get down, child." He reached up to pull her from the saddle. "Don't," Nell said sharply. Thomas froze. He looked up at her, confusion clouding his tear-filled eyes. "Nell, it's me. It's Pa. You're safe now. We'll get you a doctor. We'll get you some proper clothes. We'll fix this. I am not broken," Nell said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "And I am not staying." Captain Hayes emerged from his office. He walked slowly toward them, his eyes fixed on Nell. He saw the buckskin. He saw the braid. And he saw the way she looked at him, with the cold assessment of an enemy commander. "Miss Harper," Hayes said, touching the brim of his hat, "you are a long way from home. I am here to speak for my husband," Nell said. Thomas flinched as if she had struck him. "Don't say that word." "He is a savage. He kidnapped you. He is the leader of the people you massacred in the valley," Nell said, turning her gaze on her father. "And I am here to negotiate the release of the survivors you took in chains." Thomas stepped back, his face draining of color. "Negotiation? Eleanor, have you lost your mind? You are a victim. I am a messenger," Nell said. "I want to speak with you. Captain, inside, and I want the Indian agent present." The negotiation took place in Hayes's office. It smelled of stale tobacco, starch, and nervous sweat. Nell sat in a wooden chair, refusing the tea they offered. She laid it out clearly. She described the attack on the valley. She named the women who had died. She described the baby on the ground. She spoke with a clinical, icy precision that made the government agent, a soft man from the East, turn pale. "This is the story I will tell," Nell said. "I will write it down. I will send it to the papers in San Francisco and New York. Heroic army slaughters mothers and infants." Hayes rubbed his temples. He looked exhausted. The campaign had been a disaster. He had lost men, he had lost horses, and the Apache were still loose in the high country. "What do you want?" "Nell," Hayes asked, "I want the prisoners taken from the valley released to us. I want the army to stop hunting Colonel's band. In exchange, we will go to the high mountains. We will not raid the settlements. We will keep the peace. And if we say no," the agent blustered, "if we simply keep you here for your own protection, then my husband burns the territory," Nell said calmly. "And I scream the truth from every window until you have to gag me, and you will never have your peace." Hayes looked at her. He saw the resolve. He knew the cost of a protracted guerrilla war in the mountains. He knew the budget was gone. "We cannot release them all," Hayes said finally. "The warriors. Some must go to Florida, to the prison. We cannot let the men who fired on troops walk free." Nell fought for every soul. They haggled like horse traders over human lives. In the end, she won the release of the women, the children, and the elderly. The warriors who had been captured would be sent east. It was a bitter pill, but it was the best she could get. When she walked out of the office 2 hours later, she had a paper signed by the captain. Thomas was waiting for her by her horse. He looked at the paper in her hand. "You are going back to him?" He said. It was not a question. "Yes," Nell said. He stepped closer. His face was twisted with a pain that was terrible to witness. "If you get on that horse, Eleanor, you are dead to me. You are no daughter of mine. You are a traitor to your race and your blood." Nell looked at the man who had raised her. She remembered the fear in his house, the silence, the crushing weight of his expectations. "I was dead in this house." "Pa," she said softly. "I was a ghost. I am alive now." She mounted the horse. She gathered the reins. "Goodbye. Thomas," she said. She turned the horse toward the gate. She waited for him to call out, to say he loved her, to offer some bridge across the chasm. But he stood rooted to the earth, his pride anchoring his boots to the dust, watching her go with eyes of stone. Nell rode out of the gate. She did not look back. The tears blurred her vision, hot and stinging, but she did not wipe them away. She let them fall, watering the dry earth. As her horse picked up speed, galloping toward the tree line where Colonne waited, the reunion at the base of the trail was a scene of raw, shaking emotion. When the wagons arrived from the fort the next day, carrying the released captives, the air was filled with the sounds of weeping. Women ran to embrace husbands who had thought them dead. Children clung to their mother's legs. Nateha found her aunt among the group and wept openly, her face pressed against the older woman's shoulder. But there was sorrow, too. Wives looked for husbands who were not there, men who were on a train to Florida, never to return. The victory was bruised and limping, but it was a victory. They had clawed something back from the mouth of the beast. They made the slow climb back to the high valley. The winter came hard that year. The snow fell in sheets, burying the wickiups in white. The wind howled through the pines like a lost spirit. Life was a constant struggle for warmth and food, but the atmosphere in the valley had changed. There was laughter now. Children played in the snow, sliding down the slopes on pieces of bark. In the evenings, the fires burned bright, and the stories were told. Not just stories of the past, but stories of the present, stories of the long walk, the fight in the canyon, and the woman who rode into the fort and came back. Nell and Colonne worked side by side. The hierarchy of the past had dissolved. They were partners. They planned the spring planting together, discussing where the corn would grow best. They organized the hunting parties. When disputes arose in the band, the people looked to both of them for judgment. Their love, forged in the furnace of danger, settled into a deep, abiding rhythm. It was in the way Colonne would warm her hands in his when she came in from the cold. It was in the way Nell would read the fatigue in his eyes and quietly take the burden of leadership from him for an evening. Their moments alone were sacred, in the quiet of their shelter. With the blizzard raging outside, they would lie wrapped in the buffalo robes. The desperate urgency of their early days had softened into a profound, leisurely exploration of each other. They spoke in whispers of the future, of the children they might have, of a world that they would build within these cliffs. One evening, late in the season, the sky cleared. The first snow of the new year began to fall, huge, soft flakes drifting down in the silence. Colonne and Nell stood at the edge of the valley, looking out over the drop-off. The world below was a vast expanse of white, beautiful and indifferent. Colonne wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "We survived the winter," he said softly. "We did," Nell answered. He turned her in his arms so that she faced him. He looked down at her face, tracing the lines that the sun and the wind had etched there. She was not the smooth-skinned girl he had seen at the well. She was weathered. She was scarred. She was beautiful. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his voice dropping to that low, intimate register that always made her shiver. "Tell me when to stop." "Eleanor." It was the question he had asked on the ridge. It was the question he had asked when the snows began. It meant everything. "Tell me when the burden is too heavy. Tell me when the cold is too deep. Tell me when you want to go back." Nell looked up at him. Her eyes were bright with tears, but they were also bright with a stubborn, fierce joy. She reached up and tangled her fingers in his hair, pulling him down to her. "I never will," she whispered. She kissed him, and the snow fell around them, settling on their hair and their shoulders, binding them together. They stood there for a long time, two small figures against the vastness of the American West. Below them lay a world built on prejudice and power, a world of lines drawn on maps and hatreds nursed in the heart. But up here, in the breath of the mountains, they had carved out a space that belonged only to them. Their hands were intertwined, their bodies leaned into one another against the cold wind, and their love, quiet and fierce and unbroken, endured. Thank you for listening to this story of Nell and Colonne. It has been a journey through the dust and the snow, and I am grateful you walked this path with us. I would love to hear your thoughts on their journey. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel so you do not miss the next adventure. Share your thoughts in English, and let us keep the spirit of these stories alive together. Until next time.